Hello everyone, this is Gabriel Martins, your usual host of Fuel the Pedal podcast, and as you may have noticed, I'm not starting right away with the usual electronic guitar music jingle. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe in your homes with your loved ones, no matter in what country you are. These are troubled and sensitive times for everyone, as everyone is well aware of, and it's impossible to ignore the current situation without addressing a few words on this matter. And if you're hearing this episode in the later future, this won't probably make much sense to you, but let it be known that this episode, along with the following ones, are being recorded during the new coronavirus pandemic. So if you're listening to this by the end of 2020 or after, you may know more about this than we all do right now. And hopefully by then, this is merely a harsh memory in the history of mankind and something that I only wish that we can overcome in the best way possible with the least number of casualties. As you may know, I am broadcasting from Madrid in isolation, where the situation is dramatic beyond words, and apologies if this is somewhat a gruesome way of starting this episode, but I believe that since this is a podcast not only for exercise performance but also on health that concerns not only cyclists or endurance athletes but the general public as well, I feel I should address this issue before going into today's episode. And although today's topic has nothing to do with the coronavirus outbreak, it may be appropriate to provide some information on it. If during any point of this introduction regarding the new coronavirus outbreak you wish to jump into today's episode, you can skip by going straight to minute 10:55. So now you know that I will be dedicating a considerable part in the beginning to this topic before getting into our interview with Patrick Wilson. I know the majority of you are probably tired of hearing what I'm about to say, but being in Spain, one of the most affected countries in the world by the new coronavirus pandemic, and having a podcast that can reach all corners of the world, in particular countries who are still in an initial phase and are still in time to break the spreading of this virus and flatten the curve as it is being said, I feel somewhat responsible to try and provide my tiny grain of sand to everyone that can find this useful. And this goes beyond the micro scale of having the Cycling Spring Classic races and the Giro d'Italia cancelled, and possibly many other, if not all, cycling and sport events globally being cancelled this year. Some of the following information that I want to share with you was obtained from the World Health Organization and other governmental institutions, and more than ever it is critical to obtain information from official sources, as much inaccurate information has been circulating around the internet as it would be expected. So, regarding the basic things of this specific virus, as you may have heard before, I'm not going to bother you too much with this. People may be sick with the virus for 1 to 14 days before developing symptoms. The most common symptoms of coronavirus disease are fever, tiredness, and dry cough. Most people, about 80%, recover from the disease without needing special treatment. Most rarely, the disease can be serious or even fatal. Older people and people with other medical conditions such as asthma, diabetes, or heart disease may be more vulnerable to becoming severely ill. There's currently no vaccine to prevent coronavirus disease, although many research groups in several countries are working around the clock to get one as soon as possible. But what you can do to protect yourself and prevent the spreading of coronavirus, and again, I'm sorry if this sounds repetitive, but it's what we can do to flatten the curve. And what is this flatten the curve that everyone is talking about? So flattening the curve refers to using protective practices to slow the rate of coronavirus disease infection so that hospitals can have room, supplies, and doctors for all the patients who need care. A large number of people becoming very sick over the course of a few days could overwhelm a hospital or a care facility. Too many people becoming severely ill with coronavirus at roughly the same time could result in a shortage of hospital beds, equipment, or doctors, as it is happening in the north of Italy and here in Madrid, where the hospitals are at full capacities and even hotel rooms having to be improvised to be used to treat infected people. So if you're in one of those countries where the number of cases is still low and you still think that this is a simple simple flu, I beg you to start taking things seriously. And I say this because those of us who are in a country like Spain, perhaps now we wished that we could have acted a little bit faster, and I know I do want you not to make the same mistakes as we did. And this applies to sports as well. I still see people in other countries I have contact with, particularly my own country in Portugal, where contrarily to what happens in Spain, where very severe fines exist to control people from going outside, in some countries that don't have these punishments, if you will, as severe, people are still considering going outside to work out under the illusion that if you do it alone, there is no risk for yourself and others. But this not only puts you at risk, but it increases the risk of you suffering an accident and having to occupy a bed of your national healthcare system for someone who needs it more to treat the coronavirus. And from my view and from the view of healthcare professionals here in Spain who are appealing people not to go out working out is selfish and irresponsible. The only league you're going to be competing is in the hospital league. And it's important to know that if you do feel sick, the coronavirus pandemic is making everyone aware of hand washing and protecting others from cough and sneezes. Along with those essential steps, practices such as social distancing and self-quarantine and isolation can slow the rate of infection in a city, town, or community. And now a quick word on what truly is my area of expertise, what this podcast is usually about: nutrition. First of all, one thing that I consider to be essential: stop panic buying. There is no need to stockpile or buy more food than you normally would. If you are not ill and you are only undertaking social distancing, you can still visit the shops to buy normal supplies. The governments have no plans to close supermarkets around the world, and any shortages at the moment are being caused by panic buying and not for actual shortages. And that includes toilet paper. If you are sick and need to self-isolate, plan your shopping, yes. Make this a time for planning meals with your family and cook as much as possible, and don't rely or over-rely on processed foods, as I see in pictures around social media and in the few times I had to go out to buy food here in Madrid. So these are times with much less physical activity for sure, so hydrating yourself, maintaining a high protein provision, moderate carbohydrate intake, but with the highest possible consumption of fruits and vegetables is imperative. So it may seem obvious, but make sure you are not storing things in your fridge that don't need to be there. For example, fresh tomatoes, unpeeled onions, unpeeled potatoes don't need to be stored refrigerated. Removing these items from your fridge and storing them in a cool, dark place will free your fridge space for more perishable items. One thing that you want to avoid is food waste at all costs. So try to use your fresh and more perishable ingredients first before foods with a longer shelf life. Focus on increased shelf life of your cooked products as much as possible. Store foods in properly sealed containers in the fridge. There is currently no evidence to suggest that the new coronavirus is transmitted when handling or preparing food, but please continue to follow general food safety advice, washing your hands, cleaning surfaces, and separating raw meat and fish from other foods when preparing food. If you do get sick, it is worth having a few easy to cook and prepared foods in the house on standby, like canned soups, microwavable rice, and frozen ready meals that are easy options that you can keep in stock in reasonable quantities if you don't have the energy to prepare more complex recipes. Using food delivery systems may be also a good option, and it appears to be safe, but bear in mind that there are people who may need it more than you, who are incapable of going out to do shopping on their own, and my advice would be to not over-relying on these services. Much has been said also about boosting your immune system, and this has led to some national dietetic and nutrition associations like the British Dietetic Association to issue official statements regarding this. On the website of the British Dietetic Association, you can read, simply put, you cannot boost your immune system throughout diet, and no specific food or supplement will prevent you from catching coronavirus. Good hygiene practice remains the best means of avoiding infection. To date, the European Food Safety Authority have not authorized any claim for a food or food component in the UK to be labeled as protecting against infection. This doesn't mean, of course, that there are many nutrients that are involved with a normal functioning of the immune system, and so we could would encourage maintaining a balanced diet in order to support immune function, including copper, folate, iron, selenium, zinc, vitamins A, B6, B12, C, and D, but we don't recommend any food over another, but instead encourage eating a variety of foods to maintain a health-balanced diet. So in this particular situation, we are talking about maintaining immunity, not increasing it as it's being claimed throughout the internet. Now, while I understand that the idea of supplementing with specific vitamins or antioxidants, it's appealing and we all want to protect ourselves and our families, but this is a matter of perspective and prioritizing what we can control, not giving people the illusion that by taking large doses of vitamin C, for example, you are protecting yourself from the coronavirus when the impact of that would be microscopic compared to the basic things that we can actually control, like self-isolation, washing your hands, and having a right balanced diet. So this novel coronavirus will surely continue to have an impact over the next weeks and months, and possibly beyond that. So while looking out for one another, particularly those in vulnerable groups, we should do everything we can do to stop this virus. And social distancing is of clear public health importance. These are challenging times for everyone, but I'm confident that we will get through this if everyone does their role in their own country, state, community, or household. And now, let's begin with today's episode. Welcome back again to Fuel the Pedal podcast. This is episode 23, and now that we got this necessary introduction out of the way, we can resume our normal programming schedule. As you may have seen by the title of this episode, today's topic has nothing to do with the current situation, but is something that hopefully will have the chance to apply when we overcome this. Today we are bringing back a topic that has been tackled here before by my good mate Dr. Jamie Pugh, and so today we are talking about gastrointestinal distress in endurance athletes and how to avoid or minimize the symptoms. And today's guest is Dr. Patrick Wilson from Old Dominion University, Norfolk, Virginia. And let me quickly tell you how this episode came to be. So a few months ago, Patrick contacted me to see if I wanted to review his recently launched book, The Athlete's Gut. He sent me a printable version of the book and I read it. So this works as a disclaimer for me as well. I did read the book and I have no financial interests, nor I reached some sort of agreement with Patrick to praise his book here on the podcast. I'm having Patrick and I'm praising the book because I genuinely think it's a remarkable book, very well written with a solid scientific support. Patrick is a researcher as well, having contributed himself to some of the research on this topic, which makes him a righteous person to write about this. So after that, I invited Patrick to talk about this topic because I believe this is a topic worth insisting. So inevitably, his book is going to provide some of the basis for today's lineup of questions. So as many of you are certainly well aware of, the majority of endurance athletes suffer from some kind of gut problem during training or competition, and this involves professionals and amateur athletes as well. Symptoms like nausea, cramping, bloating, side stitches, and the need to defecate can negatively impact the athlete's performance. So questions like why are gut problems so common during exercise, and what can athletes do to prevent and manage gut symptoms that occur during training and competition are some of the questions that we are going to try and answer today. And since this is quite a dense episode in terms of content, this is going to be a two-part episode. So today we are hearing part 1. This episode, along with episode 6 with Dr. Jamie Pugh, are going to be complementary episodes on this topic in case you want a more complete and different perspective on this matter of GI distress and what causes it, how can we overcome it, and train our gut and try different strategies until we find what really works for each and every one of us. We're going to talk about prevalence of GI distress, some data available on cyclists, the factors leading to GI distress, and how can this manifest in athletes, gender differences, the case of triathlon and ultra-endurance racing, and dehydration. And on part 2, coming soon, we're going to be talking about the pre-race meal and how to get it right. We're going to talk about coffee as a possible trigger for the symptoms in some people, everything about foods, snacks, and drinks that cyclists consume during racing, and this includes some new energy bars that are on the market, carbohydrate concentration, ratios of glucose and fructose, and energy gels. And we're also going to be talking about an emerging topic, which is the alginate and pectin-based carbohydrate drinks that you may have heard about, the FODMAPs diet, and finally some supplements that can positively or negatively affect GI distress in athletes. So without further ado, let's get on to business. Episode 23, The Athlete's Gut, the inside science of digestion, nutrition, and stomach distress, part 1, with Dr. Patrick Wilson, up next on Fuel the Pedal podcast. So, hi Patrick, welcome to Fuel the Pedal podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right, Gabriel. Thank you for inviting me on. It's going to be nice to chat a little bit about gut distress in athletes and specifically cyclists, and talk a little bit about some of the things that they might be able to look at.
For sure, Patrick, and I can't wait to dig right into it. But before that, I believe it's inevitable to talk about what's going on in the world right now regarding the coronavirus that is affecting everyone worldwide, particularly here in Spain, and unfortunately has also reached the United States, where Patrick is right now. So again, if you're listening to this in the future, we are recording this on the 20th of March 2020, when the world is still stopped during the current pandemic that is changing every day. So, Patrick, how are things back there, and how are local authorities handling everything, and how are people reacting to this situation?
Yeah, they're okay. I mean, we're obviously a little bit behind many of the other countries in Europe and China. So I think there's more of a mixed response here right now from people, where they're not seeing the large numbers as what we're seeing in places like Italy and Spain and China and other places. So, unfortunately, some people aren't necessarily taking it as seriously as they probably should at this point. I'll go out for a walk and make sure to keep my 6 feet of space between me and the other people. But you still see people sometimes in large groups. My wife was out for a walk yesterday with her son, and there was a group of people playing, a pickup basketball game, people in the crowd. So, there's a mixed response at this point. I think that's in part because people have not started to see the consequences yet, and until they do, unfortunately, I think some of us aren't taking it as seriously as we probably should.
No doubt, and this was something that we were talking about before the recording started, that unfortunately this initial denial phase has happened, and it's still happening around the world, and hopefully the introduction message of this podcast and both our testimonials contribute to convince people of how serious this can be if we don't act fast. But enough of this. Patrick, could you please tell us about you and some of your background and research regarding these topics?
Yeah, so I am an assistant professor at Old Dominion University. I've been here for about 5 years or so. I got my PhD at the University of Minnesota, and that's pretty much where I started to do some of my research on gastrointestinal function and symptoms in athletes. For my dissertation research, I looked at multiple transportable carbohydrates. I'm sure a topic we'll dive into a little bit later on. But for one of my studies, I had runners in the lab for prolonged runs that last about 2.5 hours. I gave them different sports beverages and looked at metabolism and then GI symptoms. So since that time, I've continued to do research on a variety of topics, including gastrointestinal issues in athletes. In the last couple of years, I've started to really focus on some of the psychological origins of some of these GI symptoms, in part because I think it's been an area that's been really understudied. So we've got a couple of studies that have come out now in the last 2 years here that are showing, as you probably would expect, associations between things like anxiety and stress and gastrointestinal issues. I'm currently, again, at Old Dominion University. I direct the Human Performance Lab, and part of what we do is look at some of the things that cause GI symptoms in athletes, primarily endurance athletes, and then potential remedies for that, including nutritional and maybe some psychological.
So, a lot of research indeed on gastrointestinal stress in athletes, which culminated in your recently launched book, The Athlete's Gut. And as I said before in the beginning of this episode, your book is going to be the basis for our talk today. And I'll introduce today's interview by reading an excerpt of your book. So, it goes like this. If members of the public were polled to name the most important anatomic and physiological features that make a great athlete, several answers would likely come up over and over again. Powerful muscles, a big heart, efficient lungs, nerves of steel. References to the digestive tract would almost certainly fail to make it to the top of people's lists. Even though most of the public doesn't consider the gut to be a key part of sporting success, countless athletes know all too well how crucial it can be to making the winner's podium or even simply finishing a race for that matter. This is an excerpt from The Athlete's Gut. So, as I've said before, this is not the first time we approach this topic here on the podcast. Last year, we had Jamie Pugh from Liverpool John Moores University talking about this as well. And I believe Patrick will surely provide some additional and much needed information on this topic that is complementary to that episode 6 when we had Jamie Pugh. So one of the popular quotes that you may hear about this topic is that more marathons are won or lost in the porta toilets than at dinner table, which is a great analogy to put things into perspective. And I had the opportunity to read Patrick's book, as I've said before, and I can tell right away that it's full of funny quotes like this and analogies that makes the reading much smoother and easier. For all these reasons, I still believe this is an overlooked topic that deserves a second chance here on the podcast. So Patrick, your turn to talk now. Why did you feel the need to write this book in the first place?
So a couple of reasons. I think probably one of the more important reasons is you kind of alluded to, almost every athlete at some point or another is going to have a problem with gastrointestinal distress. Now, sometimes in surveys you'll look at the incidence and it's fairly low. So you might see a survey of cyclists or runners and the percentage experiencing gastrointestinal issues, or at least moderate to severe issues, is fairly low. However, the issue with that is if you track athletes over longer periods of time, the majority of them are going to experience one moderate to severe symptom at some point during a 1-month period or a 2-month period. So as an example, there was a study I did a couple of years ago where I tracked 150 distance runners and asked them to report their GI symptoms over a 1-month period. And after every single one of their runs, they rated nausea and vomiting, reflux, fullness, cramps, gas, and urges to go number 2 on a 0 to 10 scale. And on any given run, most of these athletes were not reporting severe symptoms. Most of them were reporting between a 0 and a 2. But if you look over the entire month of that training period, you see rates as high as 70% for athletes, for example, reporting an urge to go number 2 that was a 5 or more on that 0 to 10 scale. Similarly, you're seeing maybe 20 to 50% of athletes at some point or another reporting a severity of 5 or more for other symptoms like fullness, cramping, and nausea. So I think it's somewhat of an underappreciated problem. It's true that yes, on any given training session or race, the bulk of athletes are not going to suffer from severe GI symptoms in most cases. But if you follow them for longer periods of time, you see that most of them at some point will. So the other reason is that, honestly, there's not another book out there on this topic that comprehensively focuses on it. So I know there's some other books that include chapters or sections that go over some of these issues, but not really from a comprehensive perspective. Okay, so in the book, what I do is go through each kind of plausible symptom you could experience, explain why that can happen, and then go through some of the remedies for each of those symptoms. And the key is that the remedies are oftentimes symptom specific. So if you have an issue with nausea, a remedy that fixes gas or bloating may not apply to fixing nausea. So sometimes there's an issue of people just overgeneralizing and saying GI distress when often we want to think about what are the individual symptoms that people are experiencing. So that was another reason why I thought it would be a good idea to write a book on this topic. I kind of took a look around when I started writing and didn't really see anything out there comparable that was geared towards athletes and coaches and practitioners.
Well, and I'm sure many people are happy that you had the idea of writing this book, and hopefully this issue is now faced in a more accurate way rather than just telling athletes to train the gut, which is a somewhat vague advice. And you've mentioned some important things, one of which the trouble in quantifying the problem and generalizing gastrointestinal distress and not facing the individual symptoms. And in the particular case of cycling, people might be more familiar with the case of Tom Dumoulin some years ago during the Giro d'Italia. So, Patrick, is there any specific data on the prevalence of this issue in cyclists and how this is different or maybe different from other modalities?
So it kind of similar to with runners, it gets a little bit tricky because sometimes the rates or the prevalence that you see is going to vary a lot depending on the population that they studied, and then the environmental conditions that those people were exercising under, the duration of the exercise, the intensity, and then probably most important is which symptoms did they ask about. So the most common symptoms that you see tend to be actually belching and gas, which are not very severe, but if you include them in a questionnaire, you see rates that are pretty high. However, if you exclude those, the rates of kind of overall GI distress go down because those two tend to be, more the common ones that you would actually see appear either during a race or training. Specific to cycling, there are not as many studies as what you see with running. There's one that I kind of pulled from the literature that was published in 2012 in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise. It was from Pfeiffer and her colleagues. But what they did was they asked professional cyclists, in addition to some other endurance athletes, the severity of 12 different GI symptoms during races. And these symptoms were reported on a 0 to 9 scale. And for the most part, they found only about 4 to 7% of cyclists reported experiencing at least one of those 12 symptoms, or is greater than a 4 on that 0 to 9 scale. So 4 to 7% would be the percentage experiencing, kind of at least moderate to severe symptoms on any given kind of competition. So it goes back to the point that I made earlier on that a fairly small percentage of cyclists would probably be expected to experience severe problems during a stage race or a time trial. But over time, if you look over months or years, you're likely to see a pretty large percentage of them having at least one time or situation where it was a big problem for them. So the prevalence data becomes pretty difficult just because inherently there are a lot of things that impact GI symptoms. And the prevalence that you get in these studies is going to vary depending on how long the exercise is, how intense, what sort of food and fluid they were consuming, how experienced they are. So it's really hard to generalize. But a main point that I would make is that on any given race or competition, most are not going to have a severe problem, but over time, the majority will experience at least one situation where it becomes a problem.
Sure, and we'll go through some of the factors leading to these symptoms. But before that, in order for listeners to realize just how important this is and how even the most experienced athletes can be affected by this problem, I must refer to some of the anecdotes of different elite athletes you've collected to show this. And again, I must refer to Tom Dumoulin, and I must apologize to Tom himself if he's hearing this. Apologies also to Askar Jokendrup, the nutritionist of his current team, Jumbo Visma. But this was back when Tom was part of Giant Alpecin. So apologies for insisting, Tom, but thanks to what happened to you, independently of what the causes may have been, we have a radical example just to show people how this can seriously affect cyclists. So for those who are unaware, during stage 16 of the 2017 Giro d'Italia, Tom Dumoulin had to engage in a frantic chase after pulling off his pink jersey, dropping his shorts, and running down a roadside bank for surely the most famous natural break in the history of the sport. Patrick, so just like this example, I'm sure there are plenty of others that can be used to show the listeners how nasty this can be. Could you go over some of these anecdotes and the possible reason why even the most trained and experienced athletes can still suffer from gastrointestinal distress?
Sure. So I go through, a number of anecdotes, including the one that you mentioned. Another one that was pretty high profile was Paula Radcliffe in 2005 for her London Marathon. I think she was at around like mile 21 or 22, where she kind of briefly swerved over to a race barricade, squatted down, pulled aside her shorts, and went number 2. It's kind of hard to tell from the video that that's actually what she did, but after the race, she basically said she was having stomach problems and that she just felt like if she stopped there and went, it would be better in terms of her ability to move on with the rest of her race. Now, there's other sports as well, so I don't just cover endurance athletes. I do talk about examples from American football, for example. There's a offensive lineman for the Philadelphia Eagles, Brandon Brooks. He's a all-pro lineman who's had well-documented sort of struggles with anxiety that is severe enough to cause him to vomit before pretty much all his games. And he was even briefly hospitalized for the issue, and he's missed a number of games over the last couple of years. And his problem seems to be more product of pre-competition anxiety than anything else. I mean, you can go back to the first Tour de France, and one of the competitors there, Hippolyte Couturier, a French cyclist, had to drop out of the first stage because of severe stomach cramps. He was one of the competitors that was thought to be a contender for the title of the race, but at that point, if you dropped out any stage, you weren't eligible to win the overall race. So that obviously had a big impact on him. So the question is, how can so experienced athletes still have problems? I think in part it's because there are many different causes of GI symptoms. So unless an athlete is constantly paying attention to every single aspect of the possibilities of what can cause those issues, it can be pretty challenging to completely avoid GI issues. I mean, we're talking about chemical causes, dietary causes, pharmacological causes, psychological causes. The gut is an organ that integrates with your nervous system. So, it is really, I think, challenging for athletes to completely eliminate the possibility of having any sort of gastrointestinal problem, especially if you look over months and months of training competing. At some point or another, they're probably going to have an issue. Now, kind of a silver lining is that people who are more experienced tend to have fewer GI symptoms or less severe GI symptoms. And that's a correlation that's been documented in several studies, including a couple that I've done, that the more time you've spent competing or training in that exercise modality, the lower the prevalence of symptoms. Now, the correlation is pretty small, which means that it's not a huge change over time, but it's enough to suggest that the more you do the competitions that you engage in or that you're training for, you're modestly less likely to have problems over time. And I think that makes sense logically for most people, is that if you spend more time, gain more experience with your sporting endeavor, things are going to probably get better in terms of your likelihood of having gut problems. And the other thing you have to remember is for elite athletes, especially cyclists, if they're trying to consume 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour, that's a delicate balance, right? So they're trying to maybe oxidize as much carbohydrate as they possibly can to maintain their work output. But on the other hand, consuming that much carb poses some extra risk in terms of gastrointestinal symptoms. I don't think it's natural for most humans to consume 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors probably weren't consuming large amounts of food when they were doing any sort of physical activity, certainly not at the intensities that you see endurance races being competed at. So it's not natural, I think, for most people to consume that quantity of food or carbohydrate, particularly when you are working at such a high intensity.
For sure, and we'll soon get into the context of cycling. And in this particular context, as you've mentioned, considerable amount of carbohydrate are consumed, sometimes more than 90 grams per hour over the course of several hours. But before that, Patrick, I know that this is very dependent on the factors you've mentioned, the duration of the event, the intensity, and other environmental factors, perhaps. But one of the major themes that you focus a lot of attention in your book is regarding the causes and etiology of gastrointestinal distress. Can you go through some of these?
Sure. Yeah, in chapter 2 of the book, I go through each of the symptoms and kind of highlight all the possibilities in terms of the underlying causes of those issues. But you can kind of also think about there's probably 4 or 5 things that make most GI symptoms worse. So one of those things during exercise would be reductions in gut blood flow. And we know that particularly with very intense exercise and very prolonged exercise, those reductions in gut blood flow tend to be more pronounced. And that is maybe perhaps why you see GI symptoms being more prevalent during high intensity exercise as well as ultra endurance races like a 100-mile run. So there's been some studies where they've looked at 100-mile run athletes, and you see the prevalence of any sort of GI symptom be 95% or more. Now, not all those are severe, but maybe half of those athletes are experiencing severe issues, and that's in part a product of the extreme duration of those activities. So that's one possibility. Something that can further exacerbate that reduction in gut blood flow would be heat stress and dehydration. Okay, so your body's kind of competing for resources during intense activity, right? You're wanting to send blood and oxygen and substrate, carbohydrate and fat, to the working muscle. So the gut typically isn't the priority. Now, when you're dehydrated, you have probably even less blood volume to go around, and less of that is going to make it to the gut. And in heat, if you're exercising in a hot and humid environment, your body's going to further redirect some of that blood to the skin for the purpose of cooling. So especially when you undertake exercise in a hot and humid environment and fluid losses start to add up over time, most of those symptoms you look at, bloating, nausea, cramping, reflux, all get worse under those conditions. So definitely exercising in hot and humid environments, you consistently see GI symptoms, almost all of them being worse in that environment. And then a couple other things would be stress and anxiety. That tends to make people more maybe hypersensitive to their environment. They have kind of what we call visceral hypersensitivity. And that is basically someone who, let's say a certain amount of food or fluid in their stomach, and compared to somebody else, they just are more sensitive to that same amount for whatever reason. It's probably a change in the nervous system where they become just more aware of what's going on with their body, in part their gut. So if you ask them, they're probably more likely to report severe symptoms in comparison to a person that doesn't have that same level of what we call visceral hypersensitivity. So visceral hypersensitivity is something that we see like in irritable bowel syndrome and disorders like dyspepsia. Those people tend to just be more sensitive to what they put into their GI system. And that's maybe mediated in part through stress and anxiety that they're experiencing in their life. So those are 3 or 4 things that generally make most GI symptoms worse, or at least people perceive them to be worse if you see some of those things in an athlete, for example.
Right, and Patrick, I was wondering if there are any relevant sex differences regarding prevalence, frequency, and severity of symptoms. Do male and female athletes usually have the same type of symptoms?
Yeah, in both the general population and in athletes, you tend to see certain symptoms being more common in women, particularly abdominal pain, bloating, and constipation. So there's others like diarrhea, heartburn that are basically the same in men and women, or even in some cases like heartburn, you might see that more commonly in men. So it does probably vary to some extent depending on what symptom you're asking about. But on the whole, you probably would expect to see more symptoms in women than you would in men. Now, exactly why that is not completely clear, but you can kind of look at examples like bloating. You might expect that to be more common during different phases of the menstrual cycle. For constipation, it may be more common in women because substances tend to transit through the colon slower in women, and the longer those substances stay in your colon, the more water is reabsorbed. So more water absorption is going to generally lead to harder stools, which is going to translate to more constipation. So yeah, it varies to some extent depending on the symptom, but as a rule of thumb, I would say it's probably a little bit more likely that the majority of symptoms would be more common in women than in men.
Good. So now that we got all this relevant data on prevalence, let's move on to a more practical and applied side of things. We mentioned the particularity of road cycling due to its intensity, duration, and even physiological demands, which allow for a very high amount of carbohydrate to be ingested, sometimes superior to 90 grams per hour during the course of several hours. And we have the case of Chris Froome, whose dietary strategy during the 2018 Giro d'Italia has been previously described in more detail here here on the podcast before with Dr. James Morton, but there are other sports such as triathlon where extreme challenges on the gut can happen as well. And I know I usually don't talk much about triathletes, but since you have research specifically on triathletes, I thought it would be a good idea to have you share with us your expertise on this.
For sure. Yeah, I've done some studies with triathletes. One of them was with my dissertation. I did a field study at a sort of 70.3 mile triathlon, I believe, basically a half Ironman. And you generally see the prevalence of symptoms start to go up from the bike to the run. But the one difficulty with triathlons and making inferences about that is that obviously those modalities are kind of done in sequence. So you're doing the run always after the bike, meaning the person is potentially more dehydrated. They may have more heat stress, just cumulative load on the person. So it gets a little bit challenging sometimes to extrapolate from triathlon specifically, just because the order of the modalities is kind of always the same, generally speaking, and that complicates the interpretation. I would say the type of event that's probably most likely to elicit GI symptoms is going to be ultra running. And that is in part because of the duration, and then also just because of the mechanical jostling that goes on that can probably cause some micro damage to the intestines, the colon, and trigger more severe symptoms. I think I mentioned this earlier on, but during a 100-mile ultra race, there's been some studies showing that any level of GI symptoms is present in more than 95% of runners. Okay, that's coming from Marty Hoffman's research group, who have done a lot of research with the Western States Endurance event in the United States. Now, not all those people are getting severe symptoms, but maybe 40% or so have GI symptoms severe enough that they say it impacts their performance. And nausea is the primary one where people will actually quit a race if they experience it bad enough. Now, specific to cyclists, I think in comparison to running, they probably have a more equal distribution of upper and lower symptoms, whereas runners on average probably are more likely to experience lower symptoms. And when I say lower symptoms, I mean diarrhea, loose stools, urge to defecate, abdominal cramping in the lower region of the gut, whereas bikers may be slightly more likely to also experience, regurgitation, reflux, fullness. So there's a variety of factors for that. One is maybe bikers can just consume more on the bike, or they're in a hunched over position, which can cause more reflux or fullness. It's a tough thing to kind of disentangle exactly why you see some of these differences. And it probably depends on the duration of the event, the intensity, and who the competitors are. But on average, you probably see, again, more of an equal distribution of upper and lower symptoms in bikers in comparison to runners.
And it surely is important to be aware of those differences, no doubt, for us nutritionists. So another thing that is also clear for those of us who work with endurance athletes and who practice cycling and other endurance sports as well, is that race intensity plays an important role in gut tolerance, ultimately in generating symptoms of GI distress, as we've been talking about until now. But thinking about other factors such as dehydration and even heat stress as additional triggers of GI distress, these are environmental conditions where cyclists and other endurance athletes usually compete, particularly if we consider races in the Middle East or other countries with very high temperatures and high humidity conditions. So, Patrick, my question here would be, as nutritionists, how can we anticipate this in order to minimize GI distress when an athlete is competing in such locations?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think on an individual level, it's maybe hard to predict who's going to have issues in that type of environment. You might do some field testing beforehand in a hot and humid environment if you have access to that, to see how your athlete responds, to see potentially if they're going to have to adjust their nutritional intake based on, maybe a higher severity or frequency of GI symptoms. There's not much research that I'm aware of that looks at how you would modify a nutritional approach based on the environmental conditions that a person's participating in. So it's all kind of coming down to trial and error, experience. And I think most athletes get frustrated with those recommendations because it's basically saying, figure it out yourself. But the research isn't really clear on that at this point. We just don't have studies to say exactly how you'd best handle that. Now, what I'll say is maybe the most difficult one to program for is hydration, because in a hot and humid environment, you're going to have an athlete sweating a lot, assuming they're working at a pretty high intensity. So the higher rate of sweating means it's easier to develop dehydration. And we know that dehydration can probably exacerbate most GI symptoms. So, a lot of athletes or coaches might think, okay, well, then we've got to up the hydration in a hot and humid environment. The problem with that is if you ask athletes to drink above and beyond their perceptions of thirst or above and beyond what they would normally self-select to drink, GI discomfort ratings go up pretty substantially. So what I would say is that if an athlete is going to be competing in a hot and humid environment and they know their sweat losses are going to be large, what they would probably want to do is over the weeks and months before that event, in their training sessions, practicing or trialing a higher rate of fluid ingestion, because there is some evidence to suggest that if you do that repeatedly, the discomfort that you feel with that is going to go down over time. So, for example, if an athlete is going to be expected to sweat 2 liters per hour, most cyclists are probably consuming, at max 900 milliliters per hour naturally. So if you want to try and consume a liter or slightly more per hour, you're definitely going to have to practice that volume, that rate of consumption to make sure that you can tolerate it, and that perceptually it's not going to be sort of disastrous for you if you just try that out for a first time during a race. So hydration is tricky because it's kind of a balancing act. Too little can lead to dehydration and gut symptoms. Too much can have the same effect in terms of provoking gut symptoms.
I really like what you said there, because we can't simply tell athletes to drink more during the competition if they're not used to. Firstly, because this needs to be practiced before, and ultimately because this is vague, and in the worst case scenario, it can lead to hyponatremia if we are talking about a very long race event. So in this scenario, wouldn't perhaps having the athlete go a few days before, acclimating and even measuring fluid losses just by using before and after weight to obtain a rate of fluid loss per hour, and then adapting the drinking strategy accordingly, wouldn't this be an adequate strategy not only to minimize dehydration but to minimize symptoms of gastrointestinal distress as well?
I think for certain athletes it makes some sense, especially those who are going to be doing events that last more than a couple hours. I mean, if you're doing something that lasts an hour to 2 hours, I don't know that there's a lot of value to trying to do something really scheduled in terms of a hydration plan. I mean, I would probably just go with sort of a thirst-based approach. But if you're doing something that lasts several hours, there's more likelihood that the mismatches between your fluid intake and sweating are going to add up to something that impairs performance. So if you are one of those athletes that's doing a 5-hour event or something like that, then yes, there may be some benefit to doing a field test to see what your sweat rate is, assuming you're doing that test in an environment that matches your competition and at an intensity that matches your competition intensity, because those are two really big things that are going to affect sweat rates. I would also agree with you that you should not just automatically start chugging fluid during exercise. You don't want to gain weight from before to afterwards. That's a clear sign that you're over drinking. And in reality, it's probably unrealistic to expect most athletes to completely avoid any weight loss or any fluid loss during exercise through their drinking. And it's probably not a great idea to even try to completely rehydrate during exercise itself, because as you mentioned, the risk of hyponatremia can go up if you're being too aggressive with your fluid intake. So hydration, honestly, is one of the more controversial areas of sport nutrition. There's kind of a group that says drink to thirst. There's a group that says test your sweat rate in an environment that you expect to compete in. I think which of those approaches works better depends on the athlete and depends on the situation. If it's something fairly short, less than a couple hours, I think the vast majority of athletes are going to be fine using thirst or something similar. But if it's longer, some athletes may experience fluid losses that ultimately do negatively impact their performance.
And that's as far as we go today. This is the end of part 1, and we've tackled the more theoretical parts regarding this topic. And on part 2, we are going to dive straight into the practical aspects regarding the pre-race meal composition, the in-race nutrition, the FODMAP's diet, and how some supplements can positively or negatively affect the gut. Before we finish, I'd just like to leave you with an appeal that Patrick left at the end of this recording regarding the coronavirus disease situation, and that I feel I should leave you with now, because every day counts, and waiting for part 2 of this episode to show it to you guys may be too late to act. So I'll leave you with Patrick's message. As for me, I wish you all the best, and please stay home and stay safe, people.
Yeah, I mean, I would say pay attention to what the people who study infectious diseases say. There's some great researchers and clinicians out there who have the best set of recommendations. I'm trying to follow them as best as I can. Wash your hands, sanitize your hands, especially if you are going to a public place and either are touching stuff there yourself, or you are going with your kids or someone else. And then also, again, trying to stay away as much as you can from people. It's a hard thing to do because, we don't see people sick right now, or that many people sick right now from day to day in our own lives. So we think, what's the point of doing this? If this person isn't sick, then why should I be staying away from them? It's in part because people can pass the virus, it seems, even before they're symptomatic. And unless we're really taking this as a collective approach to try and stop the spread, it seems to me like it's going to get significantly worse. And then at that point, once people start seeing that there's major issues, then maybe they'll change their behavior. But unfortunately, at that point, it may be too late to prevent a lot of the most significant damage that we're going to see here early on. So, I would say follow the recommendations of public health experts who work in infectious disease, and do the best you can. It's a challenging time for sure.